Today's episode is brought to you by Alexandra Park BJJ. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a full-contact martial art and combat sport that was developed in Brazil in the 20th century. With roots in Judo and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, has been developed and refined into a unique grappling art with the aim to allow a smaller and weaker individual to beat a bigger and stronger opponent with the application of proper technique. Based in Muswell Hill, North London, Alexandra Park BJJ's classes are designed so that you can develop your fitness levels, balance, coordination, and flexibility in a no-pressure environment, and to provide the opportunity to start a new sport at a reasonable price. At Alexandra Park BJJ, we aim to be inclusive so that everyone can benefit from this incredible art, not just the athletic or ultra-competitive. To book your free class, head over to alexandraparkbjj.co.uk or email inquiries at alexandraparkbjj.co.uk. Hello everyone and welcome to See Through Panel. This is a comic book review and discussion podcast. My name is Fahed Rahman and today I'm joined by Ulyana Agban. She is a multidisciplinary artist having practices in fine art and illustration. She has recently started a course to become an art educator of illustration and a comics course in Moscow. She's developing her work in storytelling through sculpture and visual images and often includes an ethnographic approach in her project. As an artist, she's inspired by her real-life experience, paralleled by big historical events. Currently, she's working on a book project that represents her family story that took place among the small indigenous people of Siberia during the repressions of the 1950s in the Soviet Union, developing a topic from a documental perspective. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm actually pretty fine and excited about our conversation. What about you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Just recovering from a cold still, so our regular listeners can probably tell from my voice it's still not fully recovered, but we'll try and get through as best we can. The book we're discussing is the Two Lives of Penelope by Judith Vanistendael. This is published by Europe Comics. Well, the English language version is anyway. I'll read out the blurb. So Penelope is a Belgian physician who works with Doctors Without Borders in war-torn Syria. She returns to Belgium when she can in order to see her husband and daughter, but the transition is hard. Her latest trip home for the holidays proves to be even tougher than usual as the coexistence of two excruciatingly different worlds she inhabits becomes increasingly fraught. So when I first got in contact with you, I sent you a list of different books that we could possibly discuss. What drew you to this?
Actually, the first thing that attracted my interest was the fact that I was completely unfamiliar with what medicians do during the war, how do they feel this experience, and that was the first thing that I was curious about, and also this topic was closest to my current interest, so that's why I decided to pick this one. And actually, I'm pretty glad that I've made the decision.
It's an interesting book for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think it's always kind of interesting when a book tells you what the ending's going to be at the end. So kind of the first couple of pages tells you that she's not seen her family for a considerable amount of time. So we kind of know when what the conclusion of the book's going to be. So kind of the journey of the story is discovering why she makes this decision not to see her family. So I think the book starts really with her in, well, it depends, where do you think the kind of story actually starts? Because I think the book starts with her going through explaining what she's doing in Syria, but for me the story actually starts as when she comes back home for the Christmas period in 2015. That family story that's happening kind of intercut with scenes from the work that she's doing in Syria.
Yeah, that was really impressive beginning, I guess. Yeah. Because you had to compare this two different lifestyles, I guess. And also the main idea of the book that I got, I realized that it's not for me. This whole story was about communication, actually.
Okay.
And at the beginning, I thought that this is going to be a whole different story, but during the reading, I realized that it had like, the biggest idea of whole the story for me was representing the difficulties of communication between people that can't compare each other's experiences in life. So this beginning was like slightly showing this aspect of you, I guess.
That's fascinating. You kind of picked up on that aspect, because I think probably to give the listeners a little bit of context. So Penelope, she's a doctor. She kind of volunteers for Médecins Sans Frontières, which goes to different war zones, and she's spent a considerable amount of time in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And she's coming back for the holidays, and she's got her family at home. She's got her daughter Helen, husband Otto, who are waiting for her to kind of like come back and spend some time with her. And then kind of her mother and her twin sister Maya are also kind of like quite anxious that she decides to spend more time at home as well. And it's fascinating you picked up on that point, because like from I've got to get that name right. From Penelope's point of view, the work that she's doing in Syria is really important, and saving lives out there. But from her family's point of view, that kind of left behind in Belgium, their experience is like of what is important and what's not important is kind of slightly different, and they're really concerned that she comes back and shares time and experience with them. So that the point that you picked up on there about them not being able to kind of understand each other's perspectives, I think is probably the key thing in the book, actually.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that it's the beauty of comic as a medium is to bring up topics that are difficult to discuss and difficult to explain in words. So this message pretty subtle, and that's it.
So like one of the maybe one of the things that kind of builds more on your point is when I'm just going to call her Penny because I'm struggling with the name Penelope.
Okay.
When Penny comes home, she's carrying this red bag, and inside the red bag is I don't know what the right word is, maybe the spirit or the ghost of someone that she has treated and who's passed away in Syria, and that kind of literally bringing that emotional baggage back home with her. And she's the only one that see this spirit, and it kind of builds up on the point that she's thinking about things, and she's not really she many times through the story she kind of talks about you don't know what it's like out there, but she's not really doing a good job of explaining what it's like out there. She's not really told anyone, even her psychiatrist, that she feels like she's carrying this ghost of this patient that died in Syria, even while she's back at home. So I think that's kind of the other thing is like the things that we, people who love each other and care about each other, how they hide things away from each other because you're afraid that they're not going to understand like what you want to share with them.
I found this metaphor pretty beautiful about this ghost, and also I noticed that for me the whole visual thing about this comic was about this red creature that looked like something like blood stain. And the whole visual about it was pretty impressive, because other characters, they are much more defined, and the moment when this ghost appeared was also the moment when the whole visual really collected into one. This blood stain was also a key for me for the whole choosing of material. I don't know if Judith Vanistendael usually works with watercolor, but this idea to draw this ghost like a stain that comes out of borders a bit was pretty pretty capturative for me.
For the story to work as well as I think it does do that, I think for the most part has chosen to work with analog materials. I don't think there's a lot of digital work in here. I think she uses a lot of paints and watercolors. And you can kind of see the penmanship on the painting. I'm not saying you can't achieve that with digital tools, but to me, like it's quite clear that she's used watercolors, especially with the reds. You can kind of see how that's kind of staining through different things. Why do you think she kind of might have made that choice to work analog? Because I know, speaking from other creators, it increases the amount of time to complete a work because you're not able to do quick edits and stuff like that. Why do you think she chose to maybe choose the more like arduous route?
I guess that materials like that give a sense of more personal approach. Those panels, they resemble of diary, and also this handwriting gives you much more personal view, I guess, because when you work with digital, it's more difficult to get rid of like perfect image.
That is true, and it's a good point that you kind of make about the lettering. It does give it a little bit more like of a intimate feel, because like especially she's kind of giving these internal monologues that it just feels a little bit more intimate rather than if it was like digitally lettered as well. Let's talk a little bit about the relationships between different characters. To me, they all feel that they were all well written. You got a real sense that there was like a genuine personal history between all the characters and like the relationships. One of the key things I wanted to kind of talk about, what did you make of Penny's relationship with her daughter Helen? How did you think that kind of unfolded, and how do you think Judith kind of explored those mother-daughter dynamics?
On the one hand, it was obvious that Penny really cares about her daughter, but this care is somehow really distant. And also, it was curious for me to think about the concept of that family that is really, on the one hand, its work seems to be a caring family, but on the other hand, it looks like dysfunctional. And this relationship between mother and daughter, they presented Penelope like really unusual person and it was portrayed by. For me, it was noticeable from the details that she mentioned that she was into surgery from her early years, and I think that she had some different type of empathy mechanism in her.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, because with Penelope, like her priorities they don't seem to be towards Helen so much. They more seem to be towards people in the war zone.
I think that sometimes people just can't ignore things that they find vital, and sometimes it's difficult to understand, but that happens. And the other thing that I have on my mind about this family, I assume that Penelope thinks that her family may run by itself.
Yes.
And maybe I think that on the one hand, she may be right, because there are a huge amount of families that are like incomplete in some way, and there are not so many people that can replace her at war.
I think that's the other thing that kind of comes across in the book, is that she maybe feels like, well, her husband seems to be doing like a fairly good job of raising the daughter. She's got her grandmother, who kind of at the start of the book, not her grandmother, but Helen's grandmother, Penelope's mother, is the person that kind of guides Helen through that period where she has her first menstrual cycle, and maybe she feels like, well, my daughter's going to be okay without me, but these other people in the war zone, they need me there more than my family does, and that's a really difficult decision to make, I think. So we've talked a little bit about the artwork. This kind of, she uses a lot of watercolors, and kind of you can kind of see the penmanship on the page.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I'm getting a little bit more interested in, and when I'm talking to, especially to artists, is why certain color palettes are chosen. And you've spoken a little bit about the red previously. Why do you think she chose the color palette that she decided to go with? Was it to add kind of weight to the story, or
You mean the whole color palette?
yeah, the whole color palette? Because there's I wouldn't necessarily say it's light
Mm-hmm.
colors, but I would say she's working with a lot of like pastels, and juxtaposed to maybe like the harsh subject matter of some of the conversations that happen.
I guess that artist's approach was to show that while reading, I always had the idea that had a thought that something terrible is behind, like is outside of the story, and I have to interact with something that looks bright. The darkest part of it left outside of the story. And I think that the chosen colors were to show that contrast between everyday routine life that seems to be like normal, and something terrible that we as spectators cannot see. And the only thing that shows this part of Penelope's life is this red and black ghost.
Yeah.
I think it's all about the contrast, and about showing this life from the view of her family, I guess.
So some of the panels, they do look like they wouldn't be like out of place in kind of maybe like a Roald Dahl book, like a Quentin Blake, something like that. Sort of thing. For me, kind of like the favorite sequences that take place at nighttime. She does such a beautiful job of coloring the scene, so you can actually tell that they're taking place at night. Kind of there's a dark overwash over the images. There's one sequence where she's talking to her daughter just before she's about to go to bed, and then there's a sequence just after it where her husband Otto is having a cigarette. And I just think the way that she illustrates the lights in those sequences it's really beautiful. Actually, it's kind of it takes so much skill to do that, to make that look as like simple as easy as, and it's not. It takes a lot of skill to be able to do like the lighting the way that she does it.
Yeah, I also was impressed by part of the story where she's portrayed in bed with her husband, and suddenly the lines disappearing, and there are only like colorful spots that she's working with.
Yeah,
and it's really great change of this. She changes that scheme. She changes that scheme with she's working, and it makes a really really nice surprise for the viewer, and it gives you this feeling tenderness, and
like they're exchanging something there. So we've been talking about the comic for about 25 minutes. Like for me, I really enjoyed it. I think it's a recommendation for me. One thing that we haven't really talked about is the dialogue. I think the dialogue is really well written. All the conversations feel like natural conversations. So I'm not too sure who did the translation for this, but they did a superb job, because you always feel like a bit of give and go, and like there's funny sequences, and then there's exchanges of anger, and it's all really beautifully written. So yes, I would like very highly recommend everyone check this out. How about you? Would you give this comic book a recommendation?
Sure, I'm really enjoyed this piece because it's unusual, and the topic is really strange, and I think that it's something that's difficult to discuss, and I really like this one, and I've never heard of this artist and this title, so I'm really grateful that you put this on the list. And also, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Also, I've noticed that there was a curious thing about the title. I mean, Penelope.
Yeah.
I've come through Greek mythology and found out that Penelope was the wife of Odysseus. And actually, there was some lines in this comic that referred to this Greek story. And I found out that in Greek mythology, Penelope was famous for waiting for his husband that was gone for about 10 years for taking over Troy. She was the one who was waiting at home. And I think that the title, it actually works beautiful because the real Penelope of the story is the husband. And actually that's pretty nice double meaning, I guess.
Then there's also kind of like the double meaning. There's one Penelope that kind of exists in the civilian world, and then there's another Penelope that exists over there in Syria, and they're kind of like those two Penelopes can't ever really exist in the same place at the same time as well. So I think that's the kind of the other meaning of the book. So that's a recommendation from both of us. So let's talk about you a little bit. So why art? Basically, why did you decide to pursue a career in art, and how did that journey begin?
I used to be an architect several years ago, and I really, on the one hand, I enjoyed this occupation, but I always felt that the subject of my work, it isn't something that really bothered me. I was always interested in stories more, and I realized that the subject of architecture is not my cup of tea, I guess. I mean, I can deal with it, can work like that, but it's not the main thing that bothers me.
While you kind of enjoyed your work as an architect, it wasn't really your passion. Okay. I said that's
sorry.
Yes, go ahead. No, go ahead. You were speaking.
Yeah, that there was a moment when I realized that I want to work with different topics, and I want to bring up questions that are meaningful to me. So that's why I decided to move toward art, and actually I think that it was the best decision of my life.
That's fascinating. Because I know it's becoming an architect. I know some people that have qualified as an architect, and it's a really difficult thing to do. It takes a long time to study, to kind of put your portfolio together. It's not just an idea of putting pen to paper and drawing. You need to look at all the measurements and make sure the building is safe, and all these sort of things, and meeting briefs as well. So it's not an easy job to do. How long did it take you to realize that you wanted to pursue a career in arts? Was it kind of like a gradual realization, or was it just like one day you just decided enough's enough, I want to do something different?
I think that it was evolving in me, because I used to draw a lot when I was a child, but then I gave it up. I started to study at the university as an architect, and later, while I was working in the office, I started to creating sculptures, and I realized that this hobby is getting bigger than my everyday routine work. So it was growing with time, I guess. And then one day I realized that I haven't had enough of my work, and I want to try something different.
So you mentioned sculpture. What materials do you use to kind of make your sculptures?
I use ceramics, and also I try to combine with mixed media. So I guess it's mixed media sculptures, mostly made out of clay.
Clay is not the most forgiving material to work with. Sometimes it kind of having done a little bit of it myself, it can take up on a mind of its own. Sometimes have you found that as well?
Yeah, but the process of creating sculptures is much more calm, I guess, than drawing, because drawing takes lots of much more stress. Yeah.
Oh, that's curious. So you think for you, sculpting with clay is maybe more meditative than with drawing? Okay, that's really interesting, actually. So why do you think that is for you? Sorry to kind of maybe ask that question. Why do you think drawing is more stressful or takes more energy?
I guess it's all about choices that you have to make. While working with clay, you just thinking about volumes. I mean, you come up with the concept at first, with the idea, but then all you have to do is just to bring it to life, to sculpt it with your hands. And while drawing, you have to make decisions every minute. And it's much more difficult, but I think it's just different mechanisms.
When you are drawing, how do you tend to work? Do you work digitally? Do you work with analog materials? Do you work in a studio, or how does that process
Usually,
work
I
for you?
work with analog materials, and then I make post editing in digital. But not always. Sometimes I work with like oil paintings, and I work at my home. I don't have a studio yet, unfortunately, so I
Okay.
mostly work from home. Yeah.
Most of the people I've spoken to, they work from home, and a lot of them work digitally. I did speak to one person who works digitally. He says he'll just take his iPad or tablet device, and he'll go out to the park and work out there. And other people said that they could never do that. They'd find that too distracting. In terms of when you're sitting down to draw something, one of the things that's come up a lot in my discussions with artists is what they have on in the background. Is there like a particular music set list that you listen to, or do you have like a TV show on in the background, or is it kind of like complete silence
Actually, I can draw
with you?
while I'm listening to something because I think that music has a huge impact on my thoughts. And when you're listening to someone singing, it means that you are kind of letting in some other person inside of your working routine. It's kind of difficult to explain, but I feel that way. I mean, I have to work in silence.
You're the first person who said that to me. A lot of the other artists have said, "Oh, I need some music on the background."
I just can't.
Um,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Especially,
Uh, I
yeah,
think that
no,
I
no, go
just
ahead.
can't stop really listening into music when I turn it on. I mean, I start to think about music more than about anything else.
I think a couple of the artists that I've spoken to, if they're especially if they're illustrating like an action sequence or like a sequence that has got sad emotions in it, they like to listen to sad music
Mm.
because that kind of helps them some way kind of make the artistic decisions that they need to make. But yeah, no, it's interesting that you draw in silence. So it's a comic book podcast. I'm going to
Hmm.
ask you a little bit more now about comic books. So I've spoken to a few different people from different countries. Some people from South Africa, some people from
Hmm.
Georgia, the United States, all over the place. And each one of those countries has got its own different comic book or graphic novel tradition. What's the comic book? What was the comic book scene like where you were growing up, and has that kind of influenced your decision to make comics, or did you discover comics a little bit later on? And kind of let's start with that. What kind of, did you read comics while you were growing up? Basically, is
Actually,
the question.
while growing up, I wasn't reading into comics. The first comic that I came across was The Tank Girl by Jamie Hewlett. But I can't say that I was a big fan of that type of stories. It was just the first thing that I met, and I wasn't really into comics until I grew up. And actually, it was an independent Russian publishing house that impressed me. It's called Boom Kniga, and it's famous for its unusual stories. I mean, they're comics that share personal stories.
That's fine. So, what can you give me? Because it's not a publishing house I've heard of before. What was kind of maybe the first title, the first book that you read from them that kind of sparked your interest? And how did you discover that book in the first place? Was it something you just came across in bookshop? Was it online, or did someone maybe recommend it
It was a huge
to you?
festival of comic that took place in my hometown, and several publishing houses arrived it and represented their books. And the first book that caught my eye was Stigmata by Lorenzo Mattotti, and that was the story that really shocked me. The first thing that I was mesmerized by its visual language, and also after reading it, I realized that this type of storytelling has lots of strange sides, I guess. So that was the first book
Okay.
that comic book that really impressed me, and after that I became a constant reader of comic.
Okay, so that's not a book I've ever heard of. What is it? What is the story? What is the story about?
It's a story about a person
one.
that turned out to be a saint, and that's a really peculiar one because it has nothing to do with the common expectations about religion. And I would say that it's a story about hope, I guess, and
Okay.
it's really beautiful and subtle, and I was really surprised by the way that this story is told. So I realized that there wouldn't be any other form that could represent a story like that.
That's fascinating. And as that kind of the first book, or the first comic book that you read that made you realize, all right, this is fantastic art form. And was it at that point you decided, well, you realized that maybe this is a storytelling format that you wanted to work in yourself, or did that kind of maybe come along a little bit later on?
It came later because when I first when this book captured my interest, I wasn't really drawing. It came later.
Okay.
I mean, I think that it took about 5 years for me to realize that I want to be an artist. And yeah.
From the sounds of it, you don't really. It doesn't sound like you read a lot of like superhero comics.
Yeah, that's true.
I know. Yeah, I know next to nothing about the kind of Russian comic book scene. Is it developed? Is it a developed scene out there? I mean, excuse me for my ignorance.
Okay, it's okay.
I don't know, but yes. But is it a developed scene out there in terms of there's lots of publishers, or is it just a couple of different publishers, and it's very much more of like a independent scene out there?
There are not so many publishers. I guess that there are like several that are pretty big, but they're struggling actually because comics are not really popular in here, unfortunately. And yeah, there are some independent publishers that create really small stories. It's not really, I mean, there are not so many readers for this kind of stories, unfortunately.
Okay, so it's pretty similar to maybe the UK then, in terms of like in a UK bookshop, for example, you might find, it really depends on the bookseller, but quite often there won't be that many comic books or graphic novels in there. You need to go to like a speciality comic book shop to find them. Okay, so that's interesting to know. So when you did decide comic books was a format you wanted to work in, how did you come to that realization? Because like drawing is one thing and sculpting's another thing, but using like telling a story with comics is not so straightforward. It's a separate skill. So when did you decide to go on that journey?
Actually, I think that it doesn't matter how many stress it takes about drawing. I think if you feel that you have to do it, it doesn't really matter how much you suffer. I guess. Yeah. So I realized that comic and visual stories is a thing that I have to work with because it's the medium that suits to my storytelling ability. I guess it suits my type of stories, I guess.
In terms of like the artistic style that you've developed, I've looked over your Instagram a little bit. What kind of artistic influences have you taken, either from the comic books that you've read or from kind of just like art in general, in terms of like the artistic style that you use to draw?
Actually, I think that on every project I try to come up with a new style. I mean that I try to find the best language that suits it. So I have like different influencers, I guess, and it's always starts with the idea, and there is no one particular name. I mean,
okay.
Yeah, sorry. There are some artists that inspire me, but they change from time to time, I guess.
Tell me about some projects that you're working on at the moment. the intro that I read out for you. So you're working on a book project that sounds like inspired by your own family story. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, and kind of, is it a comic book or is it prose, or?
It's going to be a mix of different types of storytelling. I mean, there would be parts that are represented as comics, and there would be some parts that are mostly in prose, and some are going to be illustrated, because it's going to be like a mix of small stories, I guess. And actually, it's in the process of creating, so I'm not really sure how it will end up.
What research are you kind of putting into that? Are you talking to kind of lots of members of your own family, and you know, also in kind of like in the blurb you also mentioned you're going to maybe try and tie it into real life historical events. What research are you kind of like doing around those two different areas?
It has started with after some conversation that I had with my relatives, and we had those small like conversation about their past while I was growing up. So I mean, I was surrounded by this story. Later, when I've grown older, I realized that I have to do something with it. That this story has like huge influence on me. So I've decided to go further and visited some archives, found some documents, and also, no, I mean, I was tried to find any documental that could ever be connected with the story. Also, I came over ethnographical books that could shed some light on culture of this ethnic group. This group is called Tuvans, and it's located in Tuva Republic. That's part of Russian Federation. I mean, it's a big mixture of different kinds of information. It's like conversation with my relatives, some documents, and also some ethnographical facts.
It sounds like it could be. It sounds like it's going to be very like a time-consuming
Yeah,
project, but it also sounds like it might be like emotionally
yeah.
draining as well at the same time. Because do you want? Are you happy to maybe talk about like a brief outline of what the story is going to be, or do you want to kind of like maybe hold
Mm,
that
yeah, I
back?
can. We can discuss it a bit.
Okay, yeah, sure. So what is the basic
Um,
plot of the book of the book that you're going to be telling about, and especially when you're kind of maybe some of the sorts of events that you'll be kind of like covering
uh,
as well.
I'm not really sure what plot will be in the end, because I'm kind of in the process of creating it. I mean, I try
Yeah.
to come up with a whole storyline for it, but now it's the event that was a push for me was a story that happened with my grandfather, grandfather's father, my great grandfather, who was living in. It's hard to explain in English. Let me Google. Well, it's a story about my great grandfather who was repressed during 1950s, and the unusual part about the story is because it took place in a small village that's located in surrounded by taiga, and it's a really weird story about mix of politics and some. I think that the main thing why I started to do this is because I tried to understand the past of my family, because it was kind of unusual, because part of my family came from really closed community. It's a small village located in Tuva Republic that's surrounded by deep forests, and I realized that the story is really important, especially when you come to think about the bigger events that took place in my country. So I realized that I can
Okay.
tell personal story that parallels with huge movements in history.
So I've just realised we're coming up to an hour. There's just a few more questions, and I'll let you go. One of the questions I like to ask artists is like, what does success look like to you?
Well,
That's a big question, but yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of. I think that I would be glad and feel myself successful when I'll realize that I'm able to work only on my personal projects without having to get any freelance commissions. I mean that I'd love to devote all my time to things that I really want
to work on, rather than having to take paid gigs. I think that's a dream for a lot of artists.
True.
You talked a little bit about the Russian comic books. I'd be really interested if you could maybe give me a list of Russian comic books or graphic novels that you've enjoyed, and I'll see if it's maybe possible for me to find English translations for them. So can you remind me of the first one that you kind of mentioned earlier on in our discussion? What was the title and who was it by?
The first one I mentioned was one by Jamie Hewlett, but it's not Russian, obviously. The second one was Stigmata by Lorenzo Matozzi, and he is Italian. And what about Russians? I think that the most outstanding, one of the most, I would say, outstanding books is Survila by Olga Lavrentieva. I think that it was published abroad. I'm pretty sure. I'm not sure if it's available in English, but I hope so. It's a story about Second World War, and it's told from the perspective of a family. It's a really important book. And also, there also is a really nice book written by Julia Nikitina. It's called Midnight Land. It's also a story about family that takes place in a small city, and it's really, really beautiful, and it tells about the idea of belonging to the land. It's really beautiful, I guess. I'm not sure if it was published. I think that two of these are my favorite ones.
You've talked a little bit about the book you're working on. Are there any other projects that you'd like to tell my listeners about?
Actually, I don't have any other big projects. Currently, I'm working on a book cover for medical publication. It's not really interesting. It's just a freelance job that I have to do.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think we should have talked about? Are there any questions I haven't asked that you think I should ask?
I don't think that there are any. Actually, I'm pretty glad with our conversation, and I think that you are doing a great job.
Okay, that's great. So my last question I'm going to ask you is if you can please tell everyone who's listening to the podcast where they can find your work, where they can find you online, all that sort of good stuff, social media, website, anything like that.
I think that it's easier to find me on Instagram. You can find me by my name. Unfortunately, I don't have any other social platforms, so I think that it's the only one.
Okay, cool. And I believe your Instagram handle is u.agban at Instagram. So yeah, please check that out. Thank you very much, Yulia. It's been great chatting to you, guys and girls that are listening. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Please continue to support us. If you can leave a review or recommendation on whatever podcast app you're listening to us on, that'd be really helpful. Or if you can leave a tip in the tip jar, that'd be really useful. If you've got any comments or recommendations for books that you'd like us to cover next, please email us at c3panel@gmail.com. Cole is doing a really great job on the YouTube channel in terms of not necessarily reviews, but overviews of comic books and graphic novels that he has been reading. So please check that out as well. Ulyana, if you could say bye, let's say bye.
Bye.